the nationally recognized forensic accountant, Sam Rosenfarb.
Virtually every American belongs to some form of not-for-profit or charitable organization. Their church or temple or Rotary Club, Knights of Columbus, country clubs, professional organizations, even the Boy Scouts. We all gladly give money to these charities. But who takes care of the money, and where does it go? How often does someone have their hand in the church till? Nobody knows more about money than accountants. Hi, I'm Sam Rosenfarb. I'm a forensic accountant. On tonight's White Collar Crime Report, we have with us two of New Jersey's premier lawyers, Seth Taube and Beth Yingling. Seth is a partner and senior white-collar crime defense lawyer at McCarter & English, New Jersey's oldest and largest law firm. He was formerly a chief of enforcement of the Securities and Exchange Commission and a special assistant U.S. attorney in New York. Mr. Taube has also been appointed by the New Jersey Senate President to a commission to rewrite New Jersey securities laws. He regularly represents corporations and individuals involved in white-collar crime, including not-for-profit corporations and religious organizations. Beth Yingling is counsel to McCarter & English. She's an expert in not-for-profit corporation. She's a graduate of Rutgers Law School and has a master's degree in taxation. Ms. Yingling's extensive experience in organizing and providing advice to all types of tax-exempt organizations makes her perfect as a trustee for numerous not-for-profit enterprises. Beth, tell us, how'd you get interested in charities and not-for-profits?
Well, I started practicing law with a specialty in tax law, and McCarter & English has had a wide variety, large and small, of charitable, tax-exempt, nonprofit organizations. And in all instances, the goal is to keep them in compliance, and I got involved in assisting with the formation of
What does compliance mean? Explain compliance to our audience.
Compliance means following the rules and regulations established by statute, both state and federal, principally for tax-exempt organizations, dealing with the IRS, registering with them, filing the required returns with them, both initially and on an ongoing basis.
Are the rules complicated?
They are fairly complicated, yes. And then on the state level, there are additional requirements as well.
So there are federal rules and state rules too?
That's right.
And that's so that these corporations, organizations can receive tax-deductible contributions?
That's right.
That's what makes them exempt.
Exactly. And we all benefit, or most of us benefit, from making deductions on our tax returns for charitable contributions to viable charities, organizations that use the funds to help other people and do good things in the community.
Those are charitable organizations.
Yes, they are.
Seth, how'd you get involved in white-collar crime work?
Well, I was a prosecutor, as you mentioned, both at the SEC and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And in my days as a prosecutor, I came across this problem of not-for-profits, of charitable organizations being targets for white-collar fraud. I remember my days as a prosecutor when a Catholic priest was approached by a promoter, a stock promoter, who promised huge returns if he'd only turn over the fund for the poor Arizona Indians, the $100,000. And sure enough, the priest turned over the money. The money was stolen. 5 years later, that gentleman found himself in a courtroom, and the priest was on the stand, and I said, "Father, who'd guarantee that you couldn't lose that money?" And the priest said, "He did, my son." The jury was out 15 minutes.
Right.
The 75-year-old promoter spent 10 years in prison.
Wow. Well, it's tough to go against the priest when he's up on the stand pointing to somebody saying, "You're guilty."
But the problem is you don't always get facts that are that good, and charities are targets because the people who are involved in charity, it's their avocation, their pleasure time, not their job. So you have these individuals who don't want to spend the time to run the charity, the Rotary Club, the Boy Scouts. But the law says that if you are an officer or a director of a charity, you have the same obligations as do the directors and officers of IBM. You must run that company as if the money was your own.
Well, most of these trustees don't know that, do they, Beth? You're a trustee of some charitable organization.
I serve as a trustee, and I'm all too well aware of it.
After Seth's heat of advice, I'm surprised anybody wants to be a trustee
There's a good
of an
point
organization.
But there is a definite structure to charitable organizations that needs to be followed. Most of them are incorporated. You don't need to be, but if you are, you need to follow those formalities. You have a board.
And what makes the difference whether they're incorporated or not incorporated?
Well, it's a technical requirement. If you're incorporated, you file a document with the Secretary of State in your given state here in New Jersey, with the New Jersey Secretary of State, called a Certificate of Incorporation. It establishes the name of the corporation, the number of trustees that will serve on its board, and various aspects of the corporation. That filing plus having what's called an organizational meeting establishes the corporation. You adopt bylaws, you elect officers, etc. And frequently people will get that far, or they'll file a document with the Secretary of State, but then they won't do anything else, and it will just sit there.
What kind of obligations do they have?
Well, most importantly, there's an annual filing requirement of what's called an annual report. It's really just to keep the Secretary of State informed, as to who runs the corporation. But if you don't file that for 2 years in New Jersey, the Secretary of State can dissolve your corporation automatically. Now, the good news is that you can get it reinstated without too much difficulty, but I've run into transactions frequently where finally somebody with a search the day before the closing has discovered that a corporation no longer exists, and there's a lot of scurrying around to get it back in
So there are lots
existence.
of not-for-profits, charitable organizations who don't follow the rules.
That's right.
And what happens to them when they become the victim of white-collar crime? Does not following the rules in any way affect them, Seth?
Well, one of the problems when you don't go by the rule and cross the T's and dot the I's is the individual members could become personally liable. If the corporation gets dissolved, then the individual members are liable.
You mean the
debt.
individual
Potentially.
trustees who are trustees of the charity?
That's right. A
Potentially.
person who is nice enough to spend their time for this good work winds up having to pay the bill.
That's unbelievable.
Yes.
I'm sure many of our viewers don't know that. And how can trustees protect themselves in making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed?
Well, by following the formalities, to incorporate, to adopt bylaws, to follow the process established in the bylaws of having meetings, keeping minutes, keeping the records. On the corporate side of establishing the corporation as an entity, those are probably the most important factors.
Now, most of the people who do charity work aren't involved as trustees. Most of them collect money for organizations, or they do some work for organizations. The PTA, they bake cakes for the PTA. Do they have to comply with any of these rules?
Probably not specifically. It's more a burden on the people involved in the organization itself, the officers and the trustees. What the individual volunteers need to be careful about, though, because they can ultimately be sued for negligent acts or as agents of the corporation. Ideally, a corporation may have insurance covering their possible liabilities, or people need to be careful about what they do, and it's incumbent upon even volunteers in an organization to be sure that the corporation does function as a corporation.
And how would they do that? You know, people do collect for American Cancer Society, or the Heart Association, or their PTA, or their church. How do they determine whether or not the companies do comply?
Well, they can check with the organizers involved, those people that are identified to them as either the head of the organization or one of the officers of the organization. All charities are required to register with the Attorney General's office. There's a section called the Charities Registration Section, and you can call them up
So
and see if they're
a fundraiser can
registered.
just call the state?
That's right. You can check that way. You can ask to see documents and things that may or may not be absolutely necessary, depending on what kind of information you can get from the people involved.
What makes charities particularly ripe for fraud?
Well, the classic example is the charity which has very few people actually running it. Take, for example, a situation where the members don't have time to run it, which is a classic situation, and they hire someone to run the company.
An executive director.
An executive director.
Right.
The problem is this person is often vested with complete responsibility. There's no segregation in her functions. This woman or man is responsible to take in the mail, record things on the books and records, deposit the money in the bank, notify to members what's going on. And when you have one person responsible with all the different levels of dealing with money in books and records, that person can start to play with the books. Take, for example, the situation we had in a trade organization where an individual was responsible as executive director to do everything. That person decided one year that they take loans for themselves, and they wrote themselves a check and put it in the books as a manager loan. Now, the first year, the independent CPA let it go by because it wasn't a lot of money. But the second year, the CPA, who was asked to audit, and that's important, have an independent auditor come in every year in an organization with any money. The auditor the second year said, show me the proof you have permission from the directors to get this money. Well, the manager could not show that proof, and after a few days came in crying and admitted that he had stolen the money.
And where were the trustees during all this time?
They put their faith in their hired employee. You pay someone, most people feel in a charity, they should worry about it. It doesn't work that way.
Now, it's not just a charity. It's also true of a country club or a Rotary Club or a Knights of Columbus, those kinds of organizations, social organizations,
Absolutely.
Business organizations.
Sure, and it's not only the theft of money. You have situations where employees could just falsify the books and records. Take, for example, a boat club where we had a situation where a bookkeeper was once again responsible for all the books and records, depositing the money, and the club got into financial trouble. They couldn't pay their bills. The bookkeeper didn't want to lose his job. So what he did is he started to falsify the books and records and didn't record all the bills. The mail would come in, he'd throw the ones out, and he'd call the creditors and say, I'll pay you next month. I'll pay you next month.
And
this
none of the people involved in the club knew what was going on. This bookkeeper had control.
They trusted the bookkeeper. They said, show me the books and records. She showed, or he showed in this case, the books and records. No one knew any the wiser until finally, and this is a real sign, this person hadn't taken a vacation in 10 years. Whenever you have an employee who doesn't want to take a vacation, it's because he doesn't want anyone else looking at what he does.
We're going to have a lot of happy employees out there who haven't taken a vacation in a long time. You take a vacation. Right. That's one way to make sure that people do get replaced in their job, their function gets replaced.
Someone acts as like a double check. But I think it's important for board members to review things periodically, to get financial reports from whoever is running the show, and to pay some attention to them, to try to notice if funds seem to be coming in at an alarmingly high or alarmingly low rate, if things don't seem to be going as they have been over a period of time. It is very difficult sometimes if someone is falsifying records to catch up on things, but having an independent auditor come in, having someone take a vacation and someone looking over their shoulder, having a trustee, like a treasurer on the board, look over the books and records periodically, those are kinds of things that can protect the organization.
There have been some very big frauds involved in charity. Charities involved in big frauds. Recent church fraud, the New Era Fund fraud, those have been massive Ponzi schemes. Right after this break, we'll come back and talk to Seth Taube and Beth Yingling on frauds against charity.
Greatest artist in the whole world. I want to see my name on the front page every day. I want to work in a zoo and take care of animals when they're sick. I want to make buildings for real and skyscrapers.
U.S. savings bonds can help you get them to college. They're guaranteed safe and now earn Treasury-based rates right from the start. So start saving now, and they can be what they want to be when they grow up.
I want to be a pilot.
Even if they do keep changing their minds.
Hi, this is Sam Rosenfarb. This is the White Collar Crime Report, and we're talking about fraud against charity. Seth Taube and Beth Yingling, lawyers at McCarter & English, New Jersey's largest and oldest Newark law firm. Beth, Your firm was involved in the New Era fraud. That was a huge scandal involving a charity. Tell our viewers what that was about.
Well, it's still ongoing. It remains to be settled. That's everyone's goal, I think. But what happened was a gentleman, excuse me, told many charities that they had anonymous donors who were willing to make contributions if they were matched by other donors to be given to charities identified by the second donors, that is the non-anonymous ones, and that their money would be doubled in 6 months. An instance
sounds too good to be
something
true.
where it's too good to be true that it probably isn't. It started, I believe, back in 1991 and developed fairly slowly in the beginning. And enough people had their money doubled so that even a year or two after it began, the gentleman involved could point to colleges, universities, art museums, many well-known charities who had in fact doubled their money. But what was happening was he would use the money received later to double the funds of the earlier donors.
So it was a typical Ponzi scheme.
Yes.
He used the later contributions
to pay off
the early contributions.
That's correct. And initially it was discovered, I think, based on 2 factors. One, he did run out of money, but at the same time there had been a diligent accountant, I believe, out there who had been trying to get copies of information returns forms 990 that this charity was required to file with the IRS and are required to be available to the public, and also copies of the financial statements, which were starting to show, even though they're somewhat delayed in the time they are put together, that this in fact was a Ponzi scheme, that the money was not in fact coming from anonymous donors.
So it was some smart accountant who got to catch the New Era fund.
Yes.
Those accountants will get you every time.
Yes. And now it's multi-millions of dollars that we're trying to chase down and get back so that charities have not lost their funds and donors have not been defrauded.
In this case, the charities were greedy. They wanted to double their
yes, they
contributions,
did.
And they were willing to be. They became victimized.
Yes, they did.
Well,
they were greedy, though, for good reasons. They wanted to, build a new building on their college campus. They wanted to do good things for communities. I know a food kitchen was involved. Some organizations made small contributions, doubling $5,000 and $10,000. Some of them were larger. So it was all for good purpose, but they were definitely taken advantage of.
Right. Don't let the greed get you. Watch it. Seth, tell us some other kinds of interesting frauds against charities that our viewers can look out for.
Well, often people who are involved in charities aren't sophisticated in business. Take, for example, I talked before about priests. I've had a number of situations where orders of Catholic priests have been taken advantage of. These are people who are, by nature, trusting. They believe they're doing important works, they have their own ministry, and they're not watching or worrying about whether someone's telling the truth. I had one situation where
They're not businessmen.
They're not businessmen.
Right.
They're worried about the next life, not this one, in some cases. And so what you get is, we had a situation where a developer showed up to an order of Catholic priests and said, I see you have this large piece of land in this city.
A real estate developer?
A real estate developer. Give me your land. Give me the deed to your land. I'm going to develop it. You don't need it anymore here. You've moved to another area. Give me your land and I will build buildings on it and we'll share lots of money. Of course, the priests signed over the deed, handed it to the real estate developer. Loans were taken on the property, banks got involved, the developers, the money somehow never found its way to the developer.
Shocking.
We were all shocked. And lo and behold, the banks started to foreclose and the priests were going to lose everything. In that case, fortunately, New York has a law that says you need court approval for a Catholic organization or a religious corporation to transfer land.
Oh.
And they hadn't gotten court approval, so I was able to get the land back for the priests.
Is that true in New Jersey as well?
It is not true in New Jersey. There are a lot of statutes in New Jersey protecting religious corporations, but you don't need court approval. So you don't have the same protection.
Well, the law protected the Catholic Church or the priests in that instance. That's terrific.
That's an instance where we're able to get to court quickly and get back the land. But it is, these types of organizations are prey for that reason. They're just not sophisticated businessmen. Other types of situations are vendor frauds. You often have situations where if you have a country club or a golf club or a boat club and you have services, always get quotes for your services and products, because what happens is the employee, who's usually being paid a smaller salary than in a business corporation, is approached by a vendor that says, I'll supply food at slightly above cost, and you and I will split the difference. And you don't find out about that until that manager or employee leaves, and then the new employee is approached by the same vendor, and he doesn't have the same moral scruples.
Very interesting. Beth, contributions to a charity are tax deductible for those people who make them.
Yes, they
there's
are.
lots of discussion about a flat tax. In some proposals of a flat tax, charitable contributions won't be deductible. Do you think that'll have an effect on the amount contributed to charities?
Yes, I think it may. Over the last few years, this proposal has come up a number of times, and many people get a big tax benefit from making charitable contributions, particularly significant ones. You can deduct up to 50% of your income in a charitable deduction, assuming you make that large a contribution. And I think organizations have noticed at times when these have been questioned that the contributions do go down. And there is a great concern that if the flat tax is adopted with the provision, and it seems likely, I think it's in virtually every flat tax proposal, because it's to simplify and eliminate many deductions, that will be eliminated. So
charities are concerned about these new flat tax proposals. But Americans have always been the most generous in the world.
See, I do believe that even if the flat tax gets into effect, a lot more money is going to be put in the hands of Americans. And I think even if it's not deductible, because a lot of Americans will have more money in their pocket, I don't think we will see charitable deductions, charitable contributions going down. Now, some of these plans, as Beth said, Jack Kemp's, for example, would keep the deduction, whereas others do not. But I personally believe that you're not going to stop giving to your temple or church or Rotary Club because it's not deductible. I think the charities are going to be supported in America if taxes go down even more.
In fact, most people who spend their time at charities don't get a tax deduction for the time they spend, and they're still willing to give time.
Yes.
People are generous. So I think charities are concerned because their livelihood, the charities and the executive directors, depend upon this tremendous influx of contributions. But perhaps Americans' generosity will continue.
Well, I think it will continue, but I think in the areas of discretion, not the ones maybe that you're so personally involved in, like your church or religious organization, or the things you serve on the board or you volunteer for, those are less likely probably to be reduced for a given individual. But to someone who then gives to other things that they just want to support financially, the added benefit of getting the deduction, I think, encourages that.
You mean like a trade like a Rotary Club or a trade organization? Well,
or something they're not as directly involved in.
I see. You mentioned the accountants catching these crooks. Accountants sometimes do work for free for organizations that they are members of, or they provide services at less than fair billing.
Lawyers do too.
Lawyers do too. Is that a problem for some organizations?
Well, you know, I take issue with those situations. You know, the old saying, you get what you pay for, applies to professionals too. You always have come across, I have in many cases, charities where they get the lawyer's services pro bono for free, the accountant for a minimal amount of money. Those professionals make their living like everyone else, and if they are not paid for their time, they tend to be less careful in their actions. Pay the accountants and the lawyers their time and a fair price, and you'll get fair value for you.
Another issue with that is frequently a lawyer on a board will be a lawyer, but maybe he or she will be a litigator or practice in another area of law that doesn't deal with charities.
So their specialty doesn't dovetail with what they're doing.
Now, they know how to look up in a statute and figure out a certain amount of things, but they're not as familiar with the details and all of the various aspects of running an organization. So they're doing the work for free, but even though they don't intend to, they're not really doing a complete job, and that can be dangerous. So we've had clients with those problems.
Right, because people are so generous, they're easy to be preyed upon, like this the cancer scheme that we talked about during the break. What was that? People were collecting money in the name of
a cancer
research?
organization from many states over the phone, and this is one thing to be very careful about. When someone calls you on the phone, you shouldn't be reluctant to question them and get more information in the mail before you make a commitment to contribute. But this cancer organization had these phone banks set up in many states. They ended up being sued by several attorneys general, I believe including New Jersey and Florida, and it was just a fraud, out-and-out fraud. It was not a charitable organization. It had cancer in the title. It grasped everyone's attention. People like to, support
Bill's Cancer Group.
That's right, just about.
Right.
And it was uncovered. I'm not quite sure how it was uncovered as a fraud, but it was an outright fraud.
Well, phone solicitations are ripe for fraud.
Yes.
Absolutely, and indeed, fundraising organizations are often should be suspected because some charities raise their own money. There you know that the money is going to the right place. But some charities hire organizations to do fundraising. It is not unusual for a fundraising company to charge 50, 60, 70% of the take for administrative services.
Right.
Wow, and that's legal?
And
Yes.
that is legal. And you call up and you think you're giving money to the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, 70 cents of every dollar is going to some entrepreneur's pocket who had the chutzpah to get on the phone and call you instead of the PBA doing it themselves.
And that's one question to ask, is what percentage of my contribution is going to the organization rather than to pay you who's calling me and berating me to contribute.
Right, and people do contribute money to these phone solicitation companies or
Yes,
these professional fundraisers.
There's no question. It works because the telephones are the greatest way to raise money, and you must ask when they call, are you the organization, are you employed by the organization, and how much money gets to them.
Now, the New Jersey Attorney General has taken action. There was a law passed this past year in New Jersey to improve the Charities Registration Act and require all organizations that do charitable fundraising to register with the Attorney General's office, not only the charities themselves, but the fundraising organization. And the Attorney General's office is supposed to look at all the contracts involved and try to review the arrangements to try to avoid running into situations where charities are only getting 10 cents or 20 cents or 30 cents on the dollar.
Right, it seems that that's inappropriate.
Yes.
Is it your experience that a lot of charities aren't following the formalities of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, that they're not filing the proper tax returns, the proper forms?
I think most of them are trying to comply. I think it's mostly an ignorance of the requirements and not getting the correct advice or sufficient advice, either by getting partial advice from a lawyer or an accountant who has some information but not all, or not getting any kind of professional advice. And being aware to some degree that, again, they have to file a certificate of incorporation, have a meeting every once in a while and keep some records. So I think people's intent is in the right place, but they don't have sufficient information these days because it is really quite complicated to stay in compliance.
Greed is rampant and greed is everywhere. Watch it. Don't let the greed get you. To receive tips from McCarter and English on how to prevent your charity from becoming the victim of fraud, write to me, Sam Rosenfarb, 75 Livingston Avenue, Roseland, New Jersey, or call 201-535-1300. Thank you. Thanks, Seth.